Hi everyone and welcome to this event today. My name is Anna Crow. I'm with the Human Rights Program here. And today we have a panel looking at current issues in humanitarian disarmament. I'm going to get this wrong, but targeting, toxicity, technology and trade. And this is the second of a two-part series looking at current issues in humanitarian disarmament as part of a conference that's been going on here today at Harvard Law School. The conference is the inaugural conference of the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative, which is a new initiative just launched last night by Bonnie Doherty, who's sitting over here. So a round of applause to Bonnie. We'd like to thank not only the Human Rights Program, but also the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights, as well as PAX, the Provost Fund, and an anonymous donor for making this conference and this event possible. The moderator for today's panel will be Jasmin Galace, who's a peace educator and advocate from the Philippines, and she also recently played an instrumental role in the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I'll hand over to you, Jasmin.
Thank you very much, Anna. So good afternoon, everyone. So as Anna said, this is a panel discussion on the current issues on humanitarian disarmament. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, humanitarian disarmament refers to the prevention and reduction of armed violence by focusing attention to the unacceptable humanitarian suffering caused by different kinds of weapons. So this panel, in this panel we have, the leaders or of the different campaigns, civil society campaigns, who will examine how the humanitarian approach to disarmament has influenced their work and how they have adapted to it to respond to contemporary challenges. They will discuss efforts to curb the urban use of certain explosive weapons, reduce the environmental impacts of armed conflict, preempt new technology that could autonomously make life and death decisions, and control the unlawful trade in arms. So I'd like to introduce to you this afternoon our distinguished panel members. I'd like to introduce them in one sweep. So we have first, to my extreme left, Laura Boillot. I pronounced it correctly, right, this time? She is program manager for Article 36 and coordinator of the International Network on Explosive Weapons. So Laura previously worked as a campaign manager of the Cluster Munitions campaign throughout the negotiation of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and subsequently as director promoting the Convention's universalization and implementation. And prior to that, Laura worked as program officer for the International Action Network on Small Arms, or IANSA, working on the Control Arms campaign and on issues related to gun control. Friends, this is Laura Boillot. The second speaker we have for today is Mary Wareham, and Mary is Advocacy Director of the Arms Division, where she leads Human Rights Watch advocacy against problematic weapons that pose a significant threat to civilians. Mary also serves as the global coordinator of the campaigns to stop killer robots. So from 2006 to 2008, Mary served as Advocacy Director for Oxfam, New Zealand, leading its efforts to secure an arms trade treaty and the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions. Mary was senior advocate for the Arms Division of Human Rights Watch from 1998 to 2006 and was responsible for global coordination of the Landmine Monitor Research Initiative. From 96 to 97, Wareham worked for the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, assisting Jody Williams, in coordinating the ICANN, or the international campaign to ban landmines. Okay, so to my right is Anna Macdonald of the Control Arms Coalition, and Anna is the director of Control Arms, and she leads the global civil society coalition working to reduce armed violence and conflict through international arms control. She was in Oxfam for 18 years. Yeah, she was director since she was 2 years old, right? Because she's 20 right now. So she has been in a range of positions, including head of arms control, and where she played a key leadership role in the successful campaign for an arms trade treaty. She's an amazing woman. She has an MA Development Studies from Leeds University and a BA Politics and Geography from Sheffield University. And to my extreme right is Doug Weir. I hope I said that correctly, Doug. Okay. You can complain if not. So he's the Research and Policy Director of the Conflict and Environment Observatory, which is founded in 2013 and, and focuses on research, policy, and advocacy on conflict and the environment. So maybe he can say more about himself later on when he speaks about his campaign. So each member of the panel will actually be given 7 minutes. So I'm going to like flash the 1 minute thingy if they continue to speak after the time frame. So and each one of them will actually introduce their campaign, and the end goal of the campaign. This is also just to remind you, my friends, of what you will speak about. And they will talk about your work and how humanitarian disarmament actually have responded to the specific challenges like faced by your campaign. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Laura.
Thank you, Jasmin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much to Bonnie Doherty and all of the organisers for inviting me here to speak and putting on these events over these couple of days. I'm going to talk today about the work of INEW, which is the International Network on Explosive Weapons. INEW's a global civil society coalition that was set up 7 years ago, and it was established to work to prevent the human suffering from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Explosive weapons in populated areas is quite a specific policy framing of an issue which we find useful given its focus on engaging states and doing outreach with them. But it essentially, in lay terms, is about an issue of using bombing and shelling in towns and cities. This practice perhaps isn't an intentional practice, but it certainly represents a shift that we've seen more in recent times towards more urbanization of conflicts and also generally situations where civilians find themselves caught up in the center of hostilities. The category of explosive weapons is a fairly broad category of weapons. We're talking about aircraft bombs, artillery, rockets, mortars, all of which function by projecting blast and fragmentation around a point of detonation. These are weapons that are generally used by the militaries and designed for use in open battlefields. And we see considerable problems when these style of weapons are used in urban centres, in towns and cities, because of their blast and fragmentation effects around a wide area, in areas where there's dense concentration of civilians. So that's the issue that we're focused on. It's a top humanitarian concern today. It's been recognized by the UN Secretary General. It's been recognized as a problem by the ICRC and by a growing number of states, as well as civil society organizations. And it's killing tens of thousands of civilians each year. It's what we found from the data and the research that we've done within INEW, and particularly an organization called Action on Armed Violence, is that when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 92% of the victims are civilian. So we see this pattern of harm as a distinct problem across a number of different countries and contexts. And each year we document this in around 60 to 70 countries. And it's been a big problem, in particular last year, where we've seen an increase in airstrikes in towns and cities in Yemen, in Syria, and Iraq. But besides the death and injury, which is obviously a significant problem in itself, people living under the shelling and bombardment suffer significant psychological trauma and causes people to flee, contributing to the problem that we see of displacement. But the way that these weapons work also have a significant impact on the built-up environment, damaging buildings, tearing down buildings, impacting people's homes, but also essential civilian infrastructure and the provision of services, which is often centered in towns and cities. So we see hospitals being destroyed, impacting on medical services, schools, power supplies, electricity, water supplies, sanitation. So, I mean, this presents a very significant and severe problem to civilians living through conflict situations, but also for many years after a conflict ends. INEW is calling on states to stop using heavy explosive weapons in populated areas. Our focus is on weapons that cause a wide area effect, so big aircraft bombs that have a large blast radius, weapons that are inaccurate and not reliably hitting the targets, and explosive weapons that scatter munitions over a wide area. So we think that applying this standard of not using explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas should help to significantly prevent and reduce harm to civilians living through armed conflict situations. So that's our issue in a nutshell and what INU is working on. I'm now going to talk a little bit about how it fits in with this broader humanitarian disarmament framing. First of all, we very much focus on this issue from the humanitarian perspective, looking to understand the impact that it has on people and communities. And that's something that other campaigns previous, also the approach that they've taken, notably explosive campaigns on landmines and campaigns on cluster bombs, which are also explosive weapons but have been prohibited under different treaties. And we try to draw a line between what we see as acceptable behaviour and unacceptable behaviour, and trying to call this practice out and challenge the notion that this is just an inevitable part of conflict situations. We're working to do this, as with other campaigns, to set new international standards. So within INU, we're working with states to develop an international political commitment to not use explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, as well as other commitments to help assist affected communities, both the individuals in those communities and the communities at large. We see an international political declaration as a tool that can help to drive forward changes at the national level. And I think for this issue in particular, driving forward operational changes among militaries to be more specific in the recommendations and the guidance that they give their militaries in the conduct of military operations around the use of explosive weapons. Another similarity to other humanitarian disarmament campaigns has been the partnership that the partnership model that we have taken in how to achieve this political instrument. We're working very closely with Austria, Mozambique, Chile, Ireland, and a group of states, as well as international organizations like the ICRC and UN OCHA, to achieve this political declaration and work to ensure that it's effectively endorsed by states and implemented. But it differs also from other humanitarian disarmament issues. I think most notably it's a fairly broad issue in terms of the category of weapons is quite large. We're not looking to prohibit explosive weapons, and that's been a focus of other campaigns where we've had a very sharp focus on a particular type of weapon and work for a prohibition through a legally binding instrument. So that's slightly different and working towards this international political declaration, but we still hope that it will set a clear and strong standard that we can help change the behaviour of states. And it's quite a challenging issue to work on. I mean, we're at the early stages of the development of a new international political declaration. We've all been working on this issue for a number of years, and it will probably take another couple of years, I think, to develop a political declaration, but we have had success in building up recognition of this problem as a pattern of harm among a broad constituency of states. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Laura. That's really a very challenging issue that you're working on, and so I'd like to ask, before I open the floor for questions later, how do you see this issue playing out in the next 5 years?
Yeah, thank you, Jasmin. I mean, I think our focus, like I said, at the moment within INU is on a specific advocacy objective around developing this international political commitment. We would like to set a standard against this practice through an international political declaration, but like I said, we see it as a way of really driving forward change nationally by states, and that's really going to be the change that we want to see that makes a difference to the lives of people in armed conflict situations. But working with states to develop national policies and procedures that lays out this commitment to stop using heavy explosive weapons in populated areas. So that's a focus for us as an advocacy coalition over the next few years, and really building up a big group of states that are able to get on board this commitment, and also a kind of forum and a grouping of states and civil society organisations to convene and to discuss the issue and to talk about how it's working out in practice, and making sure that it is making a difference.
It's great. That's laudable work, Laura. Thank you very much. Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I was going to talk to you about the campaign to stop killer robots, and maybe just some of the lessons that we've been applying to that campaign from the Humanitarian Disarmament playbook. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is a coalition of more than 60 non-governmental organizations in approximately 28 countries. Large NGOs like my one, Human Rights Watch, Article 36 is also part of it. PACs and other leaders from the campaign are actually here in the room as well. We spent a lot of time before we launched the campaign talking about our goal and the framing of this issue. We launched the campaign in April 2013, but before that, Human Rights Watch put out its first report on this topic called Losing Humanity, the Case Against Killer Robots. And Bonnie was the author of that report and all of the subsequent reports. These are joint reports that we've done with the Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Law Clinic. Nearly, I was close there. Those reports have been absolutely critical to framing this issue, to giving it a name, and to laying a strong foundation for our campaigning work. So for us, the name that we gave these weapons is fully autonomous weapons. Other names you might hear are lethal autonomous weapon systems. That's what the governments call them. But you can imagine a coalition to stop lethal autonomous weapon systems that would not have gotten off the ground. Therefore, we use the term killer robots. And we certainly got a lot of attention from that, which was part of the purpose in the early days. But we turned that attention and directed them towards the reports that Bonnie was producing. The first report that she produced included a chapter on what we called precursor weapon systems. Precursors, as in this is where we could go if we do not, draw the line. And it gave examples of existing weapon systems today that have some autonomy in them. People think about armed drones, which are aircraft that can fly autonomously, but they have a person back at the base, soldier, who decides what to target and who takes the decision to fire. Our concern is that those critical functions of weapon systems in the future might lose that human control and become, in effect, machines that then take the human life. This is a moral line which we do not want to see crossed. In that first report, Bonnie laid out really well the international humanitarian law obligations and how, as we're seeing the technology today, these weapon systems would not be able to abide by the core principles of international humanitarian law when it comes to distinguishing civilian from combatant, when it comes to undertaking the complex proportionality calculation, which military commanders must do. And she's followed up that research with other explorations of not just the IHL implications, but the international human rights law implications. That report was called Shaking the Foundations, and that one looked very strongly at the notion of human dignity, the right to life, and all of the other ways in which these weapon systems would violate those basic rules of international law. Another report that Bonnie did was called Mind the Gap, and that was about the accountability gap that these weapon systems would cause if they were used, and the lack of recourse for potential victims of these weapons. So we felt like we had a strong basis to launch this campaign with, and we decided from the Humanitarian Disarmament Playbook that it had to be a coordinated initiative where we spoke with one voice with a clear goal, and we put the goal out there right at the very beginning. The goal is to prohibit the development, production, and use of fully autonomous weapons. That's the kind of negative way of framing what we want to achieve. And the positive way of framing it is that we want to ensure that there is always human control over the critical functions of weapon systems, so the selection of targets and the use of force. We talk a lot in the campaign about meaningful human control. Other people talk about appropriate or necessary. But this is the positive way of framing our goal. We want to establish that principle and draw the line at weapon systems that fall outside of it. That's the prohibition part of it. But about 6 months after we launched the campaign in 2013, governments agreed to start discussing this topic at a treaty called the Convention on Conventional Weapons, the CCW. You might have heard Steve talk about this yesterday. It's the place where landmines and cluster munitions were first negotiated before the states failed and took it outside. We're still at the CCW, and there have been 4 meetings to date, and there's another one coming up in April, another one coming up in August, chaired by the Ambassador of India. And those meetings are not so much decision-making meetings. That will happen at the end of the year. These are meetings for states to explore some of the key concerns that we have. And the 2 kind of big topics that they'll be looking at this year are what they call characteristics of lethal autonomous weapon systems. What do we mean by that term? What is captured by that? What are the elements of concern there? And the other one will be this term human-machine interaction, which is where we talk about the nature of human control over weapon systems. And hopefully governments will come prepared to share from their own experience with their own existing weapon systems how they function today and what makes that acceptable, because that will help us to understand where to draw the line in future. It's easier, I think, if you look at the near-term projections rather than thinking about the Terminator and other more sophisticated uses of military AI that the roboticists tell us will come, but not for a few more decades yet, so don't worry too much. What else did I want to say? So just with the last minute, talked about our goal, our coalition. We have a light institutional structure right now. Basically, we don't have staff. I give my time to the campaign, as do others in the campaign, but we do not have staff or a secretariat or a bank account or a legal status or anything else. We're just a cool name and a great, great logo, but a powerful idea, and we aspire to create new international law on this as quickly as possible, and we see that as being possible by the end of 2019. We do not see that governments have got the time or the resources to waste and having lots and lots and lots of discussions about this without an objective to work towards. And I guess one of the differences that we have from some of the other humanitarian disarmament initiatives that you'll hear from is that we generally don't talk about victims because we're calling for a preemptive ban, which means future weapon systems, not so much the ones that are here today. We often get asked, where do you draw the line in the campaign? What's in and what's out of the ban? And that's where we push back with another humanitarian disarmament playbook rule, which is the burden of proof should always be on the government side. So we're like, that's a really good question, but that's something that you should be asking your government, and they should be answering where would they draw the line on autonomy in weapon systems, and how would they do that collectively through the form of a treaty? I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, no staff, no funds, but a lot of will to make a difference. So I'd like to ask Mary, how can the audience actually help advance these issues that you mentioned?
I talked already about Harvard's central role in framing this issue and in putting out those reports, and we want Bonnie to keep putting out those reports and exploring the many different ethical, legal, technical, operational, moral, proliferation, arms races. There are so many challenges that are raised by these weapon systems, and many of them have not yet been explored. This is also part of the tech hub, I guess, one of many tech hubs, but you have MIT down the street. You have a lot of artificial intelligence experts, roboticists, scientists. We've been working hard in the recent years to try and get them to use their voice and to support our objective of the ban and to be pushing for that. You'll be hearing a lot more about artificial intelligence, and the AI experts like to talk about how artificial intelligence can be beneficial to humanity, but they draw the line at certain functions, such as weaponizing it to the point that you do not have human control over the critical functions of a weapon system. So use your voice on this, use your pen on this, and think about how you can contribute, and even if it's just following our Twitter account and our Facebook page, that's a start. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary. I turn over the floor now to Doug. Doug.
Thanks a lot, and I'd also like to express my thanks to Bonnie and everybody for an excellent welcome and excellent hospitality here at Harvard for the last couple of days. So we work on the environmental side of humanitarian disarmament. Similar to Laura, we're not working on a particular weapon. We're looking at state practice and the activities that occur during conflict. Our origins kind of in 2012 when, together with PAX, we launched a Toxic Remnants of War project, which is kind of a research project which aimed to study conflict pollution and the environmental and humanitarian impact of pollution caused by conflict and military activities. And this includes traditionally chemically toxic materials and also radiological materials left over. So not chemical weapons, but kind of everything else underneath. And over the years, we had been working on depleted uranium weapons, and we had a number of questions as to why it was fine to disperse this stuff into the environment during conflict, but not actually in peacetime. Why were there no obligations to clean up not only DU, but also other toxic materials? And increasingly, it was clear that not only were we looking at some toxic weapons, things like Agent Orange, which are very well addressed, but actually there's a whole range of pollutants which are released during conflict. And conflict also creates a context where pollution is more likely. So we started looking at direct toxic remnants of war, so the residues of weapons, and also indirect toxic remnants of war, which are the circumstances associated with conflict. So, for example, in Syria and Iraq, communities affected by conflict have been refining their own crude oil because they're desperate for fuel, for heating, or for transport. But obviously, the process is particularly dirty, so you have a large barrel, you put crude oil in it, you burn it to fractionate it and extract oil and various other products, causing widespread environmental pollution, affecting the people who are operating these stills, most of whom are children. So there are coping strategies like that. There's also the collapse of environmental governance during conflict, which means the Environment Ministry doesn't function. It loses its capacity, its analytical laboratories, but then also the conduct of hostilities themselves. So increasing urbanization and industrialization is increasing the risks of pollution from bombed industrial sites, for example. It was, again, in Syria, Russia and the US have both been destroying oil facilities without any real concern for the environment. And again, this question of why was this acceptable, how is it acceptable? And international humanitarian law's provisions for the protection of the environment are extremely weak, and compliance is very poor as a result. So we developed a framing on toxic remnants of war, and in 2015 we established a small NGO network. And it was interesting. We were approaching the traditional disarmament fora that we'd worked in, like First Committee or the certain conventional weapons. And you're speaking with diplomats who have backgrounds in arms and disarmament. They're not particularly interested in the environment, as it turns out. So we're also looking further afield. So we've been working at the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is modeling itself as the parliament, international parliament for the environment. I'm working there. But there are wider questions about the environment is a real low priority during conflicts, and pollution is just one element of that. So we've also been thinking not only about toxic remnants of war themselves, but also about the system at the moment, whereby there's no clear system for states to get environmental assistance after conflict. Everything is very ad hoc. The UN Environment Programme sometimes go in if they're invited by the states to do an assessment. There are no obligations on the affected state to protect the human rights of its own people from pollution or environmental damage or degradation. So there's a whole system which needs to be addressed. And then also within that, conflict in the environment is extremely broad. So you can look at issues before conflict, so looking at climate or water risk. During conflict, you can look at IHL breaches and compliance. After conflict, there's what's the role of the environment in humanitarian response and programming? What do we look at for environmental remediation or reparations? It's a huge topic and a huge theme. So we've been working our toxic remnants of war work within the context of that, but also being forced in our advocacy to address some of these other environmental security issues as well. So there's a question of how we adapted humanitarian disarmament. Humanitarian disarmament historically is looked at weapons which cause acute harm, so explosive weapons, for example, landmines, cluster munitions. It's very easy to communicate the harm narrative from these weapons. It's rather more difficult when you're dealing with a toxic material which may cause an increased risk of cancer 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. And this is something which we'd always looked to environmental campaigning, environmental issues around toxics generally. And so we've been trying to merge some of this environmental thinking with these traditional approaches from humanitarian disarmament. And in addition, we've been looking at these norms. So we've been looking at peacetime environmental norms, precautionary principle, polluter pays, all these other principles which help to frame our approach, and also increasingly the field of environmental human rights as well. So all of this has kind of gone in for a kind of remixed version of humanitarian disarmament, which we've been sort of developing and applying in our campaigning and advocacy at different UN fora. So, for example, the International Law Commission has been studying the framework protecting the environment before, during, and after conflict, and trying to synthesize draft principles. So we've been doing a lot of work on that, and they officially recognized toxic remnants of war back in 2016. And again, as I mentioned, working at the United Nations Environment Assembly, trying to strengthen the mandate of the UN Environment Programme and its work on conflicts, and also getting past the first ever resolution on conflict pollution last December. So there's progress on a number of things, and our sort of question now is how do we locate ourselves within this wider environmental security work? So there's work at the UN Security Council on climate, on water and conflicts. There's the IHL and compliance issues during conflict, and then there's other work in the post-conflict sphere. So this is kind of what keeps us up at night at the moment, trying to frame where we work and how we can apply what we've learned from humanitarian disarmament and from the other campaigns who've gone before, and you're a huge inspiration to our work, to try and strengthen the protection of the environment and also reduce the derived humanitarian consequences of environmental damage during conflict. And I'll probably leave it there, I think.
Well, really glad there's you and your organization doing this dog. I mean, it's really important work. How did you get into it?
So when I was a lad, there weren't any of these fancy master's degrees that people seem to do these days that are extremely useful for getting into NGO campaigning and advocacy. So I studied geology at Manchester University, and then I had a departure for a few years looking at music and working on music things, but then got into writing and then did a master's in journalism, and I was quite keen to apply my geology and environmental interests, but not necessarily directly academic or to the benefit of the extractive industries. So fancy being an environmental campaigner. A job came up on a UK campaign against depleted uranium weapons, which then led to the coordinating the international campaign to ban uranium weapons, and then latterly into this. But it's a question of, even if you don't get a specific degree, there are particular skill sets which are quite useful for this line of work. So I find the writing really useful, obviously find the environmental background really useful. But yeah, it's also the case that it's quite hard to predict your exact trajectory in this line of work, and just being in it and learning from others and identifying opportunities, particularly to push forward work on humanitarian disarmament issues, all helps kind of get you to where you are, I think.
Thanks very much, Doc. So we turn over to our last speaker for this afternoon, Anna.
Thanks very much. Control Arms works to try to stop the flood of weapons and ammunition around the world. We're trying to stop arms transfers that fuel poverty, conflict, and human rights abuses. A campaign was launched back in 2003 with the objective of trying to achieve an international treaty to regulate the conventional weapons trade. So everything that is not nuclear, biological, and chemical, and everything from tanks and aircraft down to guns and bullets and their parts and components. And the reasons for this came very much out of a humanitarian perspective. The campaign was conceived of, and the first planning took place in Africa at a meeting in Nairobi of many different NGOs, African NGOs in particular, but many others too, looking at the problems and challenges towards trying to reduce human rights abuses and trying to build successful development programs. And a major inhibitor to that was armed violence and conflict. Oxfam, a big international humanitarian development organisation, and Amnesty International from the human rights perspective were the two organisations that first led the drive for an international campaign to say, okay, maybe we can try and get a treaty to regulate this industry. At the time we launched the campaign, there was no global regulation around the arms trade. There were individual national export control systems and a few regional mechanisms that existed, but at best this could be described as a patchwork system. So if you were a dodgy arms dealer, it was fairly easy to find your way around this patchwork system of regulations and ply your trade, selling weapons with impunity to whoever you wanted. The vast, vast majority of weapons begin life manufactured and produced legally, but a huge number end up in the illegal trade. So the problem, if we're going to tackle this problem, we've got to try and regulate the legal trade first to stop this huge grey area in between the legal and illegal trade, where so many weapons get diverted, go missing, end up in the wrong hands. So 5 ways in which our campaign fits into the humanitarian disarmament framework, or as learned by that. Firstly is the vision, and the vision was a humanitarian one, to try to put people at the centre of decisions around arms deals, not profit, and not politics. So we wanted a treaty that was very focused on people. And if you look at the first article in the Arms Trade Treaty, you'll see that its goal is to reduce human suffering. So that was a success in trying to push that and to get governments to take responsibility for the decisions that they were making and for the arms that were going in and out of their territories. The second was longevity. Having a long-term plan and having a global plan. To achieve change in something as big and complex as the arms trade takes time. It's not something that we can neatly do in a one-year plan. This was a long-term plan. It was a 10-year vision, and it needed partners and colleagues all around the world working on it. And our first step was to try to persuade governments that this could even work as an idea. And initially, most governments in the world laughed us out of the room and said, this is ridiculous. And we said, excellent, because if they'd all thought it was a brilliant idea, we wouldn't have been aiming high enough. So that was a good start. Gradually around the world, we built up public pressure, we got people on board, and we managed to persuade governments one by one to say, yes, this is a good idea. Our strategy was to have one champion in each region, with the idea that if we could get one government to say it was a good idea, the others would follow, and that worked. So having that longevity and having that global reach was key. Thirdly, messaging, translating the complexities of the arms trade into something that could be accessible to many people around the world. We used a lot of analogies. We talked a lot about why is it that bananas are more regulated than AK-47s? How can fruit be subject to more rules and regulations than deadly weapons that are killing people every day? That's something that provokes outrage in most people, and it's something that could be widely repeated by the media, could be widely put out on social media, and again, those sorts of statistics, those sorts of facts helped us build up our message and get profile. Adapting with that messaging too was really important. When we started the campaign, social media hadn't been invented. It's something that developed as we were developing as a campaign, so we embraced it, we tried to use it, and we tried to reach new audiences and reach decision makers and diplomats directly by adapting and using new approaches. Fourthly, we needed to have really good humanitarian knowledge. We needed to know our stuff. Over the 10 years between the campaign starting and the treaty being adopted in 2013, we produced more than 50 reports across our coalition. And those covered everything from the gendered impact of the arms trade through to why ammunition was essential to be covered, to all sorts of different weapons types, through to regionally specific studies. We looked at Africa and the economic cost of armed violence, calculating that Africa loses $18 billion a year due to armed violence and conflict. That was instrumental in bringing many African governments on board who widely would quote and requote that statistic themselves in their own arguments. So knowing what we were talking about and being able to communicate that effectively was absolutely key. And then linked to knowing our content stuff, we also needed to know the process. The UN is a complex, difficult machinery and a complex bureaucracy. We needed to be able to identify governments that we call champion governments that we could work with to achieve change. And there are big, obviously powerful governments that tend to dominate within the UN system, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council in particular. We didn't target those. We, as our champion governments, we targeted smaller governments that tended to have more progressive agendas and would work very closely with NGOs, with civil society, and with whom we could coordinate tactics and build up a strategy for effective change. That did prove successful, and now that we have the treaty, it was adopted in 2013, we're working on trying to get governments to implement it. And the last lesson of our approach is that with a humanitarian disarmament approach, the implementation of these legal instruments is as important, in fact, much more important than getting the instrument. Getting the framework is very much the first step. It feels like the end when you've had a 10-year campaign, but actually it's the first step, because now we've got the instrument, we need to use it to get governments to actually adhere to it and try to build pressure on them so that they reduce weapons flows and so that we can achieve our goal of stopping arms transfers that fuel poverty, conflict and suffering.
Thanks very much, Anna. That's controlling arms to reduce human suffering and saving lives. That's really wonderful work you're doing. Forgive me for asking this question, but I was wondering, has the election of people like Trump set your campaign back?
I think that campaigning on something like this is often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's never a smooth trajectory of a simple progress. Sometimes it looks like that when you look back at campaigns, and it looks like we did A, B, C, D, E, but it's always more jumping around than that. It's always getting advanced, and then you get a setback, and then you've got to challenge that. And without shadow of a doubt, the election of Trump, yeah, sure, it's a big step backwards. It's a major challenge, and not just in the US, but also in countries like the Philippines with President Duterte, and in other countries too, where we're seeing the rise of more aggressive populist policies. It's a major challenge. But I think we're also seeing movements of people coming together and wanting to challenge that. And we're seeing increased support in some ways at a public level for our campaigns, for our coalitions and for our movement. So I think, yeah, we've had a setback, but we're still moving to push that step forward.
It's wonderful. Actually very, happy to see many women controlling the arms, that a lot of men made. So saying that because it's Women's Month this month. I just want to also, I want to open the floor, for questions in case there are questions actually from the audience. We have brilliant minds here. This is Harvard Law School, so we'd like to hear what people have to say. Yes, please.
Well, you say you want to control arms and keep them out of the wrong hands, but how do you decide? Can you hear me at all? As far as arms control transfers go, you say you want to keep them out of the wrong hands, but how do you decide what are the right hands and what are the wrong hands? Many governments, of course, can legally obtain weapons and use them for very questionable and even nefarious ends, whereas resistance movements may actually be fighting for a cause that will ultimately triumph and be seen as a just cause. And if you keep the weapons out of their hands, it may make it more difficult. So you have to make these kinds of choices as to who's right and who's wrong when they obtain these kinds of weapons, even though it may be legal or illegal at the outset. Furthermore, as far as Trump goes, Barack Obama, in case anyone is unaware of it, signed more arms control contracts than any president in history since the Second World War. So I don't think Trump is really that much of a departure from anything that went before him. This is a very complex and ambiguous area, isn't it? I mean, if you're transferring arms to Israel in violation of America's own Arms Control Export Act, then that could be seen as legal, but is that legitimate?
And I think the question is for you.
Sure. Thanks
I wasn't so sure,
Thanks for the question. What we've tried to push with governments is getting them to make a risk assessment around every single arms deal on the basis of international human rights law and humanitarian law. So what the Arms Trade Treaty requires governments to do now is to authorise an arms transfer. So they have to say yes or no to the export, and they have to do that against the risk of misuse of those weapons in violation of IHL and human rights law. So if they have knowledge that the weapons are likely to be used, or they can be deemed to have knowledge that the weapons will be used in violation of those legal obligations, they must deny the export. If it passes that test, they have to do a risk assessment of whether there is an overriding risk that those weapons could be used for those purposes, or that those weapons could be diverted and therefore used for those purposes. And then again, if the answer is yes to that risk assessment, they have to say no. So that's the point, is to try to force governments to make that risk assessment themselves when they're trying to engage in an arms deal, to make the assessment of what the end use of those weapons is going to be, who the end user of those weapons are going to be, and to deny those authorisations where the risk of misuse is high. Our job now as civil society is to try to push governments to make sure that they are actually doing those risk assessments and that they are denying weapons sales that are in violation. One of the biggest challenges that we've got in terms of specific campaigns right now is around the situation in Yemen, where we see a number of countries, including those who've signed up to the arms trade treaty, selling weapons to the Saudi-led coalition, which is committing horrendous abuses of human rights and humanitarian law on a daily basis against Yemeni civilians. We're trying to pressure those governments to adhere to their legal obligations now. It's clearly morally abhorrent to be selling those weapons. It's now also legally against their legal obligations to sell them, so we're trying to pressure them to stop that. We've had some success in pressuring now 5 European governments to change their arms deals to Saudi on the basis of the Yemen conflict. We still have a long way to go. The US, UK, France in particular are selling vast amounts of weaponry to Saudi and have not yet stopped. So it's not a we've got the treaty and therefore abuses are over. By no means. It's creating a framework that we can then try to use to hold governments accountable and try to use it to stop such atrocities taking place.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, please.
So stepping back, in terms of U.S. politics, where does the U.S. government stand with relation to all these initiatives with respect to killer robots and explosive weapons and toxicity and arms trade? Is it at the table? Is it participating in the conversation? I'm not just talking about the Trump administration, but over a span of years. Is it the last one to join? Is it the first one, or is it in the middle?
Would you like to respond first, Laura?
Sure. I might defer also to our US-based members to add if they would like to. One of the aims that we've had within INU has to be building up recognition of this as a problem among states. So calling on them in their public statements to recognize that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas is a humanitarian problem. A lot of states can guess where we're going from that point, which is once you recognize the problem, then you want them to commit to action. And so are hesitant in expressing this as a problem, because it then it puts the onus on them to do something about it. The United States has actually recognized the problem of explosive weapons in populated areas, but it was potentially a kind of accidental recognition of the problem. It did so in the context of discussions around children and armed conflict. So within certain sphere of government in the US, there is recognition that this is a problem. The US, however, has not been supportive of the development of an international political declaration on this issue, similar to other countries, such as mine, the United Kingdom. And I think the feedback that we most often get is that international humanitarian law is sufficient, and they don't want to sign on to any additional agreements that might limit their actions. So that's kind of where things stand with explosive weapons. We've seen it before on other issues. They did the same on cluster munitions and landmines. So it's somewhat predictable. But I think we can engage also with the US militaries. I mean, even if at the policy level and decision-making level there isn't necessarily support for some of these new international instruments, we have heard from individual members of armed forces that they would like additional guidance over the use of explosive weapons in the conduct of operations. And in fact, under the ISAF operation in Afghanistan, which the US led, they took a decision or passed a kind of tactical directive that limited the use of airstrikes in Afghanistan because they saw it as advantageous to their operation there in protecting civilians. So I think there's some positive examples to draw on, but we're not going to see the United States being a leader in driving forward the political declaration.
Mary?
Thanks very much. 22 countries have endorsed the call to ban fully autonomous weapons. The United States is not among those states. The report I mentioned earlier by Bonnie and the precursor weapon systems that are out there now or in development, the vast majority that we can see are coming from the United States as the technological leader there. In part, that's because there's more transparency from the United States. They have to notify Congress of spending, et cetera. We know that there is also development happening in China and Russia, but far less information is available on that, and also Israel, South Korea, the United Kingdom. These are all countries that are investing quite heavily in autonomy and weapon systems, but they will insist to you that they're not trying to create killer robots. The United States is pretty... A couple of days after we issued that November 2012 report, the Pentagon was taking so many questions to respond and comment on it that it finally issued a policy directive that had been in the works for more than a year, involving dozens of officials across the organization, and from what I understand, fierce fights between the different parts that make up that institution. You have the technologists who want to, develop the tools there. You've also got the boots on the ground people. You've got the former pilots who are no longer pilots because the use of drones has now been so prevalent, and that was, of course, the great contribution from the Obama administration was the use of armed drones in various parts of the world with all of the issues that those raise. But armed drones are about the use of the weapon, and I guess this campaign is about the technology and where that's heading. You'll see more in the news this year and probably next year about some of the various types of weapon systems that are coming up. I didn't really explain, but a fully autonomous weapon could take many shapes and sizes in the air, on the ground, in the ocean, under the sea. And the one thing that we look for in common is how are they controlled? How are the critical functions controlled? What is the nature of human control over that? And the United States policy from 2012 talks about, appropriate levels of human judgment. Is that what they talk about? And that's similar to what we want to see, human judgment, human control. And the US says that, for the time being, those will remain under appropriate human judgment, but it does greenlight the development. So there are investments in weapon systems, and one which is particularly scary and which you might have seen is swarms. So we have drones becoming ever smaller and then being used to fly in formation. They're not weaponized yet, but that is obviously one concern. And then you have also autonomous aircraft that are they're developing really big autonomous aircraft that can fly very great distances and designing those with weapon bays, so that they could deliver weapon systems. In the international talks, the United States said okay to going through with that, to getting started on this, and it was a consensus decision. So China, Russia, all of those countries are part of the treaty that's discussing this, and they have permitted the talks to go ahead. But the ambition from these states is very low at the moment. And last time they came together in November, the United States said that it could not support any legally binding instrument at this time, let alone a politically binding instrument like a declaration or a code of conduct or something else, which begs the question of what does the United States want on this from the international community?
Thanks, Mary. Anna, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Under the Bush administration, the US was opposed to the Arms Trade Treaty and voted against it in the UN processes. Under the Obama administration, subsequently, it was problematic in negotiations, but did engage, and then subsequently signed in September 2013, although has not ratified, as it has not a great many treaties. Under the current administration, it's unclear. There haven't been any statements specifically around the arms trade treaty, although officials have continued to engage at a working level in the meetings around it. So we wait to see whether there will be any specific change in direction vis-à-vis their treaty membership.
Doug?
Yeah, I guess which bit of the US is the question. So obviously you've got a massive legacy of pollution from military activities in the US, astonishing legacy of pollution, which the DoD does its best to wriggle out of liability for and for extremely expensive cleanup, and also to ensure enough latitude as possible for their activities which may be environmentally harmful or polluting. At the same time, you have USAID, who we've been working with together with PACS on trying to improve environmental data collection during conflict, so being able to early identification of environmental risks and pollution risks, which can then help inform humanitarian response planning. But at the same time, seeing the US also quite happily targeting environmentally risky infrastructure, critical infrastructure in industrial facilities and oil facilities. But then at the same time, the negotiations at the UN Environment Assembly, and principally because Russia have been so appalling on the topic, the US have almost defined themselves relative to Russia's remarkable behaviour, and so have been actually quite supportive of the resolutions and the advocacy work we've been doing there. So it's complicated, to sum up.
Well, I hope that these responses did not discourage you. I mean, it really shows that we all have to do a lot, to be able to, make this country work better on arms control. So I'd like to ask if there are other people in the audience who'd like to ask questions. Yes, please.
Subject. Oh, thanks. I'm sorry. My question is for the whole panel about the issue of messaging and the question of what makes a good message, and also is when you develop your message, is it the same message for states and different for civil society or the populations more broadly? How can you craft an effective message? Because that seems so essential to what you all are doing.
Would you like to respond to that first? Messaging. Sure. Mm-hmm. Anna?
Thanks. I think you're right. It's really important, and something that we spent a lot of time in. I think in all of our campaigns and coalitions around developing effective messaging. I think it's very important that a message is accessible, that people can understand it. Obviously, that it's rooted in fact. And it's evidence-based is really important, that we're neither exaggerating the problem nor underestimating the problem, that we're very clearly basing it on research that we've done as part of our campaigns, and it's something that will resonate with the audience. So yes, we'll have messages that are specific to governments, which might be, when a negotiation process is underway, quite technical in terms of the substance that we want them to include in a particular treaty. And then we'll have a broader messages, perhaps at the political level, which is about trying to get that government on board with the idea of the treaty, or if they're at that time a negative government, trying to reduce their resistance to the idea of what we're trying to put forward. But I think our overall message within this sort of humanitarian disarmament fora is of the importance of people-focused solutions and of rooting our campaigns and our solutions very much from the humanitarian perspective. So we are trying to reduce the harm that's being caused by weapon systems, conflict, war, and that's our sort of overall message, I guess.
Anybody else from the panel would like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're still working on our messaging in the campaign to stop killer robots. It's been tricky because we want to be a positive campaign, an optimistic campaign. We believe that it is possible to create new international law on this, and to do that with a sense of urgency. You don't generally see from us, the Terminator and this dystopian future, because science fiction has done all of that for us already. Everybody's got their own idea in their head of what a killer robot is. But our kind of message is that what are we going to do about it? And what are you going to do about it? And how are we going to work together to do something about it? So the messages are, I guess, slightly different, more nuanced, more detailed, addressing the complexities when you're talking with the governments at a diplomatic meeting or in a briefing paper. But also remember, those multilateral meetings that are happening on killer robots are more than 80 states who are in the room, and everybody from the United States to the smallest nation states are there. And it's tricky to bring everybody's level of awareness and knowledge of the topic to the same level. But a big part of our work, which goes along with that confidence and positivity, is the capacity building effort of working with states to say you can do something about this. This is not it's so complex that it's impossible to address it, and kind of sticking with clear principles such as retaining human control over future weapon systems. If we can't communicate our campaign goal in a sentence, then it's not a campaign goal. It's an opinion piece. We've got to be quite clear and direct in exactly what we're seeking. There you go.
Laura.
Thank you. Yeah, messaging is quite a challenge for the issue I work on, because explosive weapons in populated areas is quite a mouthful, especially explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. And so that's a specific policy formulation that we use mostly with governments, and a kind of policy framing of the issue. And we have that formulation because it also points in the direction of how we address the issue in terms of solutions and our advocacy to states to stop using explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. But it doesn't necessarily resonate with the public. It's quite long and technical and jargony. So we've used more of the language around stop bombing towns and cities. It can be misconstrued, sometimes intentionally, I think, by some states who say you're calling for a ban on using explosive weapons in populated areas. That's entirely unfeasible. These are the weapons that we most commonly use and stockpile in our arsenals. And that's not really what we're focused on, but they can try and kind of spin it back in that direction to us unhelpfully. But yeah, I think like Anne said, we also try and draw a lot on the human messaging, to draw on the data collection and the kind of evidence base of describing the problem and pointing to that. And like Mary said, kind of the tone is important. So a positive, confident tone that this is an issue that can be addressed, and suggesting solutions and being quite specific and directive to states about the actions that they should be taking.
Thanks, Laura. Doug, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, just quite similar to Laura's, actually. So yeah, we've got the mixed humanitarian environmental framing, and we tend to focus on the need to minimize harm, to assess the impact of activities or incidents, and to provide environmental and health assistance to affected communities. And at the same time, we kind of struggled with the idea of whether we're being overly anthropocentric and whether people should just protect the environment because you should protect the environment because it comes in handy. And also a question about, well, with a lot of these potential health impacts, we have to talk about potential health impacts. It's very difficult to actually categorically state, well, this is your percentage increased risk in cancer over the next 20 years or whatever impact it might be. So often having to talk in potential risk, precautionary approaches, and also actually suggesting practical measures which can be undertaken to help address those potential harms. But then equally, there's also been those who challenge going, well, are you wanting to promote environmentally friendly conflict, green warfare? No, we're just trying to make conflict less environmentally damaging than it is. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. Don't know if there's anybody else who'd like to ask a question or two? Yes, please. Honor.
I didn't know whether white phosphorus was also one of the weapons that you that was in the category that you were studying. But I was wondering if Israel's bombing of Gaza, because it's periodic. I mean, every couple of years they go on these massive bombing campaigns that just about level the country. And I was wondering if there was anything specific, and I'm sure that they have plans for the future as well, if there was anything specific that was being done about that?
I think Mary and Laura would like to respond to that question.
Yeah, we issued a report at Human Rights Watch on the 2009 use of white phosphorus by Israel in Gaza, which grabbed international attention and remains one of the most popular arms reports that we've ever put out when I look at the stats on it. And that's because, you know, people could visibly see what was happening and the damage that white phosphorus was doing. White phosphorus is multiple use munition, you know, marking, tracing, illuminating the sky, creating a smoke screen. But when it's used improperly, it can cause terrible harm. And in Gaza, the attack was part of it ended up falling on a school, and some of the burning wedges continue to burn once they hit the ground, keep burning, and if they're on your skin, they'll burn through to the bone. And cause just horrific injuries. We regard white phosphorus under what we call incendiary weapons. Napalm, of course, you remember from the Vietnam War. And that resulted in new international law to prohibit the use of airdropped incendiary weapons in populated areas. It didn't really cover the ground launched, and it didn't include white phosphorus because it had these different uses. So we've been working since, 2010, 2011. Every year we document the use of incendiary weapons, and there's not really that much use of it. We haven't seen white phosphorus used again in Israel since 2009. What we have seen, though, is incendiary weapons used extensively in Syria. And we did see white phosphorus used by the U.S. coalition forces, was it Mosul in Iraq, during that operation, and there might be some possible use in Yemen. So it's part of another effort that we're trying to do here to strengthen the existing law on incendiary weapons that's out there, and to get white phosphorus added to that.
Thanks, Mary. Laura? No? Anna? Or Doug?
Yeah, just brief. I mean, there's the environmental aspects of the conflict in Gaza as well, where the strip may be essentially unlivable within the next 20 years because of the damage to water supplies and salinization of water aquifers, issues around waste disposal, which are being complicated every time there's a conflict and you have infrastructure destroyed from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And yeah, I mean, also looking at public health impacts as well. There was a paper recently which had identified very high levels of metals in the hair of babies born shortly after the conflict. So it appeared that you had in utero exposure of children as a result of exposures caused by the use of explosive weapons in Gaza, which may well have health impacts on those children. So, yeah, I mean, there are environmental aspects, there are weapons issues, there are IHL issues, and it's a melting pot of misery, I suppose, at Gaza.
Thanks, Doug. Anybody else would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Wondering, this was kind of touched upon yesterday, and how the international campaign to ban landmines was trying to frame, the use of landmines on the border between the Koreas as, there's already other tactics in place that would have the same effect. And if you guys either find yourself in the position where you're advocating for the use of a acceptable or more conventional use of weapons, when you're speaking to the military advisors that won't take, they don't want their weapons taken away from them. Do you ever give them an alternative to make it easier?
Mary?
We don't see it as our job to tell governments what weapons to use. We tell them what weapons not to use and why, and present the evidence of harm that that's causing and the rest of it. Yeah, but it's a good question.
Okay. Yeah. So, anybody else? Panelists, this room, has a lot of would-be lawyers, and I was wondering, if there are lawyers in your campaign, and if maybe they're interested to know how they can contribute or how lawyers are contributing to your campaigns right now. Anybody would like to answer that question? Anna?
Yep, we've had lots of lawyers involved in our campaign. We had in common with some other campaigns, we had a pro bono legal network that we established for the campaign and negotiations, where lawyers would offer their time for free to support both civil society and smaller states who don't have access to legal resources. It can be very uneven at the UN, where big delegations like the United States or France or others will turn up with 15 people, 5 of whom may be lawyers, and then you have smaller or less resourced countries who will turn up with one person who has to cover everything, including the legal aspects. So we established a legal network where states could confidentially contact lawyers in our network and ask a legal question and get a legal response, which was then up to them how they utilised that. And it was something which we think helped level the playing field in terms of the negotiations a little bit and allowed less resourced states to be able to negotiate with a little bit more capacity. And then for ourselves, we've had many people with a legal background involved in helping us in advising on which aspects of treaty language we might be arguing for. And colleagues such as Bonnie and her team have been invaluable for many treaty processes and have been instrumental in helping to formulate phrasing that we've then been able to successfully pass on to governments for an inclusion in those treaties, which has been really important. So for anyone considering venturing into sort of the international law aspect and getting involved in treaty processes, it's certainly something that we're very supportive of and very encouraging of from our campaigns, I think.
This is why we're all here, because we all need the support that we received from Bonnie and her team of students during the time of the negotiations, of course, and in picking apart the text and coming up with the strongest possible standard, but also afterwards, because a key part of our campaigning after the treaty is concluded is to get national legislation in place that will criminalize the activities that are prohibited by the treaty. And oftentimes that can be a real fight if you're talking about interoperability with other countries, you know, and that's where we really need the legal support as well. Obviously, ICRC is a big player here, but so too are groups like Bonnie's at the Human Rights Law Clinic and the others in the campaign. I'm personally not a lawyer. Sometimes it helps not to be a lawyer, because then you can kind of make the case to push forward the boundaries. And on the Killer Robots campaign, there's been a fierce debate legally about the adequacy of existing international law. And we try and frame our response in saying, yes, of course, international law applies, but it's not going to be able to deal with all of the challenges that these are raising. Therefore, it has to be supplemented or strengthened or enhanced, you know, and that's what we say when we want a new international treaty to deal with a specific problem. And in our case, that's the fully autonomous weapons. But that's what happened in the past on cluster munitions, on landmines, everything.
So should there be like a move, amongst the would-be lawyers here to organize a Lawyers for Humanitarian Disarmament? Please invite us during the launch. We'll be there. No more questions? So yes, please.
Well, so I've heard that the armed conflict has changed over the last decades, where mostly civilians are killed in armed conflict now, whereas in the past maybe mostly soldiers were killing each other. I'm not, too deep into this, but this is what I have heard. So I guess this is what has given rise to the approach of humanitarian disarmament, to focus on this. Is it true? And, is it working? Are we moving the needle? Do we define success as the soldiers killing each other instead of civilians? Then, is the ratio moving as a result of all these campaigns? Does it show prospect? Or will it be other factors or other geopolitical factors or something that will ultimately change this? Just I'll throw in that, we're hearing about cyber weapons and space weapons. There's some types of weapons that didn't make it on the panel, maybe the next year's panel, but, I'm just wondering how it all comes together.
Anyone would like to address that?
Sure. I think we define success as less armed violence and conflict overall and less people dying. That's how I would define success. But I think, and I'm sure others can speak to this too, but I would say, yes, we're seeing success in some of the instruments that we've been key in creating. So there are less landmines significantly in the world since the ban on landmines. There are less cluster munitions. There are cluster munitions being destroyed every day as a result of that treaty and government's commitment to do so. With the arms trade treaty, it's still relatively new. There are arms transfers that we can say we've been instrumental in stopping because of that. There's by no means enough, and there's much more that could be done on that. But I think we would see that there's been, I think it's still that sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There's successes that we're definitely having in making certain aspects of warfare and weapons use unacceptable, politically unacceptable and legally unacceptable, and then there are new problems emerging every day, like killer robots and other issues that we need to be continuously addressing and challenging. But I think, ultimately our overall goal would be, less human suffering and less environmental damage.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're certainly seeing a shift towards urbanization of conflict, which puts civilians at much greater risk than previously, and the rise of autonomous weapons systems. I think the humanitarian disarmament framing is a very useful lens to put the focus on the people and on civilians and their protection in situations of armed conflict, and less so focused on this as a kind of military security issue, which a lot of states want to approach it from that kind of framing. But the Convention on Cluster Munitions and the Mine Ban Treaty have been very important instruments in building new norms and standards against these weapons, both in terms of prohibitions. We've seen the global production of these weapons go down. We've seen it impact even states that haven't joined onto those conventions, where they've stopped producing landmines and cluster munitions. And we've seen significant progress in clearing mined areas and, like Anna said, destroying stockpiles. So I think even if it's quite challenging times at the moment, where we see a lot of civilians being killed each day from use of weapons and violations of some of these treaties, the norms are strong, and we're working very hard across our campaigns to ensure that we protect them and we build on these and set new norms and new standards that protect civilians.
So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. This has been really a very productive discussion, I think. So if you were inspired by our panelists today, please be part of our campaign. Websites, are available, and then we're also all over social media with the right messaging, I think. So please, or ask Bonnie if you have questions. So please join me in giving a warm round of applause for all our panelists this afternoon.